Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Igbopedia. I am your host, Chisom, and my special guest today is Nigerian author and publisher Dilibe Onyeama. He was born in Enugu, Nigeria in 1951, the son of influential judge Charles Dadi Onyeama, and on the day of his birth became the first black boy to be registered to attend Eton College. Dilibe became a pupil at Eton when he was 13 years old and completed his studies there 4 years later. He subsequently wrote a book, while still a teenager, about his experiences of racial discrimination and bullying at the elite British boarding school. The book is called Nigger at Eton. Dilibe obtained a diploma from the Premier School of Journalism before returning to Nigeria and establishing the publishing company Delta Publications, where he is currently the CEO. Today, he joins us from Enugu, Nigeria, where he is based. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much indeed. Happy Sunday to you.
Yeah, happy Sunday to you too. It's great to have you on, and I'm sure we'll have a very, very interesting discussion.
Yes, congratulations on your brilliant scheme of Igbopedia. Well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So let's kick off by talking a little bit about you. You were born in Enugu, as I mentioned before. Can you talk to us about your early life in Nigeria and some of your early memories?
My early life in Nigeria, from the age of about 4 or 5, I recall, right through to Lagos, when I attained the age of 8, and then left for England. And from the mists of memory, I was a rough, tough kid in Nigeria. Rough, tough kid. I loved adventure, and I loved aping adults. The highlights of those memories were when I entered my father's car and drove it into the gutter, and the whole neighborhood converged on our house, and from the shouting driver, 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 and the whole crowd, the cars in the gutter, I watched inside, and everybody came round to see. My mother, I was trying to run inside. My mother said, no, you stay there. Let them all look at you. That was one first memory. The other memory was when I was in school, and my father was summoned by the head mistress and was told, your son is too rough for us. And now I became like a sort of a ping pong between the two of them. Headmistress pushed me to my father. Father pushed me back. It went on and on until eventually they agreed to take me back. So my memories were of a sort of larger-than-life bounce on African Billy Bunter, so to speak. Yes.
That's a lovely way of putting it, and some very interesting stories there. You mentioned that you moved to England. You started boarding school there when you were 8, is that right?
That is correct, yes.
That must have been one of your first time outside of Nigeria for a prolonged period of time. What did you miss most about leaving Nigeria? And what did you miss most about Nigeria and leaving home?
Well, what I missed most obviously was family. My father, my mother, my brothers, they're all behind in Nigeria. So I missed them. Nostalgia for a long time. But anyway, I suppose I missed the sort of the third world rough and tumble, the sort of, I can't quite describe it really. I just missed Nigeria. But after a time, I acclimatized, got used to it. And Britain became my future adventure. I settled in quite fast. As I said, I was very adventurous. Anything new to me was like a source of adventure. It's like a magnetism. So, but in any event, I was going home every year for holidays. So, but initially, I was able to join in, but I was the only black African face in the prep school. And they're all very, very charming, all went the extra mile to accommodate me and make me feel very important and at home. And it was a blissful experience in those days at the early prep school. I enjoyed it. And within a few weeks, Nigeria went crashing. I sort of tuned into a new way of life. I survived it. It was a really enjoyable experience, prep school, yeah.
Excellent. And you mentioned your father a few times. Your father is Charles Dadi Onyeama, and he was the Justice of the Supreme Court of Nigeria and a judge at the International Court of Justice. So clearly a very influential and powerful figure of his time. What was it like growing up with such an important father figure?
My father was very exposed. He went to England and grew up in England for 6 years to do law. And he came to appreciate the English way of life. And he used the opportunities he had to make his way. He was a shrewd investor. He had the financial backing of my late grandfather. He had the money available. And he invested very well. And he made connections in high society English life. And one got the impression until the day he died that I wouldn't say he worshipped the English, the British, but at any rate, it was as if he didn't seem to believe the Englishman could do any wrong. And he made very, very powerful friends. And through his friends, he said, look, which school should I send my son to? The best school. And they said, well, if you want the very best, why not in college? He said he didn't believe them. He thought they were just joking. He loved the English public school system. He loved the English public school system. And he wasn't conceptualizing of the idea of putting his children in a school built by English royalty. He didn't think in terms of rubbing shoulders with English royalty. He was thinking something more modest, like Rugby, Charterhouse, He laughed at them. They said, well, yes, why not? Put them to Eton College. And he didn't believe them. And they said, oh, leave it to us. And they went and made a connection. And said, yes, put his name down. That's how it all happened.
So you were registered at Eton from birth, the first black boy to be registered at Eton from birth. We'll have a deeper discussion about your time at Eton, because I'm sure there's a lot to unpick there. But whilst we're on the subjects of family, I didn't mention it in our introduction, but you and I are actually related. We are first cousins, twice removed. And yes. So that means that my great-great-grandfather is your grandfather, and he was a man called Chief Onyeama, a British-backed ruler of Enugu and the eastern region in Nigeria in the 1900s. And now he was another influential figure in your life, but he was an immensely influential, wealthy and powerful figure at the time, an extraordinary leader of his time. You wrote a book, and you published a book about him called Chief Onyeama, The Story of an African God. Tell us a bit more about this man.
Well, he came to power through the vagaries of the hour. He was born towards the end of the slave trade. He made his livelihood because slavery in Africa, there's no culture of slavery in Africa, in Nigeria. Slavery was essentially a penal system. People who fell foul of the customs or who were misfits, couldn't fit in, who were criminals, or in between, who were captives of inter-community wars, were taken as slaves. So it was like a penal system. Now, when the slavery ended, the British brought in this system, American brought in the system of slavery, and barter. They brought all their sort of emblems of Western technology, and in return for slaves. So he made his money as a businessman, as a sort of essentially a trader. That's how he made it. And he also was exposed to many English visitors, soldiers, missionaries. And he went out, because he was a very adventurous man, and he went out, made his connections. And he won their trust. He got his wife to cook for them. And so he won their trust. And so they put him in a position of power above all the other people who were most resentful. They said, well, look at this kid born just yesterday. He's now put in a position of power over us. So that's how he came and got his warrant to be a chief. And then he was very fast as a sharp businessman, and he capitalized and made money. And according to the missionaries and what one heard, his wealth was legendary. And it was said that he was the richest chief in Black Africa. Because in those days he amassed 6 limousines and all. He was very, very rich, very powerful. And that was what made it possible for my father to use his potentials when money was available for him to go ahead and do his best. He was made to, and he did that. He brought the education, he brought Christianity into pretty well the whole eastern area, Enugu, right out to Ogoja and all the Abaja Empire. He brought in Christianity education. And that was how he was able to flourish. And he made the Western people at home, the missionaries, Bishop Shanahan, the Catholic Church. He made them all at home. And he became very popular, very influential with the government. And they used it to establish law and order. And it was effective.
Yes, and he played a pivotal role, as you say, in the development of the region, and particularly in education. And I know that there's a school in Eke, which I've been to a few times, and he built that school. Chief Onyama built that school and developed it and made sure that there was free education for the people of that particular village. He's clearly did a lot of good things for the society at the time. There are also some very interesting stories about him, because he was a very unique character, very flamboyant. One story that I know quite well, because my great-grandmother was his first daughter. And when it was time for her to get married, one of the other chiefs from a different part of this eastern region, he was Ozo Ejike, went to ask for her hand in marriage. And his family, so Chief Ozo Ejike's family, they were slightly worried. They said, "Are you sure you want this kind of man as a father-in-law?" Because he was known to do all sorts of extraordinary things. Are there any anecdotes that you can tell us a bit about him? Because there are many stories that are like the stuff of legends.
Yes, well, Ozo Ejike was his son-in-law, and he was also the power in that area of Agbaja called Owa. His father-in-law, Ozobu of Imejowa, wanted some power, but Onyama wouldn't hear of it at all. He said, no, it's just preach on my own. So there was some sort of power struggle. But Ozo Ejike was the power in Agbowa in those days. He used him to check all the other chiefs who wanted some power for themselves. And Ozo Ejike, with the backing of Chief Onyama behind him, he was able to entrench the authority and the power in that whole area. And so what he used to do, what he used to do to help make life easier for himself, he'd go and marry the daughters of influential chiefs as a way of checking their status, keeping them in place. Because he married to their daughter, and so that was like subtle blackmail. Behave yourself. I have your daughter. So that was effective. Right. That was how he got many, and but one or two cases people rebelled, and of course he was ruthless. He wouldn't stomach any opposition. There are many stories. There's one story about one particular chief who he went to ask daughter friend for marriage. The daughter said to him, "Well, no, I understand that you don't treat your wives well." And he said this in front of the chief before his parents. And so Chief Onyama laughed and went back and summoned a meeting with all the chiefs. And the father of that particular girl, he ostracized. He said, "You pack out of, I don't see the Enugu anymore." That was like punishment. Wow. And he like ostracized him entirely. So that was a story those days.
Yes, yeah, I have heard a few stories of how he was ruthless, but I guess at the time he had to be, because he was a very ambitious man who emerged from relative obscurity, but he managed to, he had the foresight of knowing that an alliance or some kind of relationship with the British is what would help him maintain his power, and a certain element of ruthlessness was critical in him maintaining that power and the influence and the wealth that he amassed. So would you describe a little bit for us how he came to pass and what eventually would become his downfall?
Well, he became very powerful, too powerful. And when a person is very powerful, then enemies get together to fight him. And all the different detractors and all the elements of opposition ganged up, bringing up all sorts of fabricating all sorts of charges, which were all rejected by the British authorities. Well, this matter got out of hand because he cracked down heavily on his enemy. He didn't spare them. Many of them he sent to prison, and others he sent his militia to deal with them. He instilled fear. For instance, the part of southern Igbos who tried to take power in the Enugu land, he wouldn't hear of it, and he sent them packing. The Obi of Onitsha, Chief Florence, all of them, all their educated elements. He wouldn't allow them to have a breathing space in Enugu at all. So they all ganged up, different, but he was powerful, and he fought them to a standstill. He lost a case with his father-in-law, who claimed that he lent him some money, and he hadn't returned it. So Chief Onyama insisted he had returned the money a long time ago, but he didn't get the receipt to show he returned it. So when he was going on appeal, that's when his enemies got together, and they planned the news itinerary. And they stopped the train. Police, they were there en masse. They said to him, "We have a warrant for your arrest and eventual deportation on exile, like King Jaja." And so when he was told that, and everywhere he went, he always had his gun with him. So he didn't want to be disgraced. So when he was told they had a warrant to arrest, he pushed his wife out, locked the door, and took his own life, rather than be disgraced and seen in handcuffs. So that was what basically happened. The enemies became very powerful. It was a long, hard struggle. He went, but he was unique in Igbo land because they say Igbo Eweheze, and Igbo authority is constantly being bedeviled by opposition. Everybody is a king unto himself, but he wouldn't hear of it.
Right.
I mean, and it was reported that he had the say of life or death. And one missionary reported that he's the only Igbo ruler whose word was law. And it was extremely dangerous to disregard his word. And up to this day, people they just don't want to hear the name of Onyama at all. And that is, he was unique in Igbo land because he wielded a power which nobody opposed at all. That was more or less what happened. And his descendants are now suffering as a consequence.
Yes. I think just picking up on the point that you made of Igbo Eweze, which means Igbo people do not have a king. And I think that's something, and that's a saying that we have in Igbo land. And basically what it shows is that in traditional Igbo land, they had democracy, true democracy, long before the British came to Nigeria.
That's correct.
Because often there is this, misconception in the Western world that they brought democracy to Africa. But actually the Igbo people had this concept of the Umunna, where you had the elders of the village, and they would discuss the goings on, and they would jointly make a decision. Whereas when the British came, they preferred to have a contact point. And in this case, in the eastern region of Nigeria, it was Chief Onyama. So they kind of changed this dynamic of democracy, essentially, by focusing on one central figure.
Yes, that was the situation because the British started off with this warrant chief, many chiefs, local councillors. Then they introduced what they call the paramount chief as an experiment of administrative kingmaking to bring the Igbos in line with what obtained in the West and in the North, the Oba and the Emir. They wanted to have paramount chiefs in Igbo land. And they experiment, what they call so native administrators or something. And they have selected 10 or 11 different big men to see if they could establish the same authority as they showed in their native land, other areas beyond their territories. And of all the 11 or so people they selected for the experiment, 2 made the grade. There were 2 paramount chiefs which were now gazetted and crowned. One was Chief Onyama, the other was Chukwane of Ozala. Chukwu Ozala had some uprising in his community, and he was almost killed. And so the British decided that he no longer exercised paramount authority. So they cancelled his status. So the Onyama became the only sole survivor of this kingmaking process. And so the British said, well, since only one person survived out of 11, then the whole system is a failure. So he fought that. He said, look, I'm a paramount chief by hereditary right. I'm an Okoroha from Oshie. So the government said, let us investigate that claim, and sent a mission of inquiry around the whole of Abaja. And they all unanimously said, yes, this man is our king. He was the Okoroha of Abaja, the biggest Igbo sub-clan. And that was the pioneer in royalty in Igbo land, where they used to have no kings.
Interesting. It was very interesting story of his life and an interesting character as well. Let's move on with let's play a small game. It's called Dream Dinner Party Guests. And if you had a dinner party at home and you could invite 3 guests, they can be living or deceased, who would they be?
Well, obviously, my father would be one. Can he be included?
Yes, of course.
Yes. I have a brother who's directly junior to me, Louis. He is living in Switzerland. He'd be another one. And I have a first cousin, whose mother was daughter of Chief Onyama, one of the best lawyers we've had in Enugu here, Barrister Herbert Ebue. He'd be the third one. These are people who we've all been to England. We all the English finesse, and we enjoy good parties, good drinks, good company, and good conversation. Those are the ones I remember offhand instantly.
Yeah, excellent. That sounds very good. It also sounds like the English culture played a big part in your upbringing and in your life. Let's talk about your life at Eton College. So Eton College is one of the oldest, most prestigious and most exclusive boarding schools in the world. The school counts the likes of George Orwell, John Keats, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, and countless members of the British royal family amongst its alumni. You were one of 2 black boys at the time at Eton in the 60s. Admittedly, as we've discussed, you were from an influential family, so you were no stranger to wealth and prestige and power. How did it feel, though, as a young 13-year-old, to be plunged into this predominantly white environment?
Well, I was used to it to a certain extent, because I spent 5 years at an English prep school. And prep school, the preparatory school, is what prepares pupils for public school education. It's exclusive primary schooling system. So I was brought up gradually and prepared for public school life. So when I got into college, the only, psychological challenge was that I was a black African going to school there. One other black African was there. So, and I heard grisly stories about anti-black sentiments, everything else. So I was a bit guarded and tense, a preset condition of ragging and bullying. That was my fear. But anyway, I'd be prepared for it anyway.
So there was another black boy at Eton at the time, Akintola. Can you describe your relationship with him and how that was formed?
Initially, my relationship with Akintola was swimming. There was no problem with casual. He was about 2 terms ahead of me, and I didn't have that much interaction with different classes, everything else. We had some good conversations together, as I say, on a casual basis. Then the coup, 1966 coup in Nigeria, when leading politicians were assassinated, and his father was one of the victims of that coup. And unfortunately, the coup plotters and those who assassinated the politicians were Igbo officers. So he wasn't amicably disposed towards Igbo for obvious reasons. When he came back, then conversation was slightly less than a whisper. So the feeling is there, and out of a matter of tact, I kept away. I didn't want a situation where anything could degenerate to all-out enmity. So it was like kept a distance. That was as a consequence of that coup d'etat, which killed his father by Igbo military officers. But before that, we had no problems as such. We had no problems. He didn't stay in the school very long anyway. He left and went to school in Switzerland. I wouldn't have said there was, by and large, the relationship was bad. It was civilized. We didn't start quarreling as such or anything, but it was cool. He lived his own life, I lived my life, but we didn't have that much interaction.
Right. And you mentioned in the book and earlier that there was some bullying, name-calling, so predominantly psychological bullying versus physical bullying. What do you think could have been done differently to make your time at Eton better? Differently by the school, for example, but also to what extent were your parents aware of what was going on at Eton?
When you say what was going on, nothing really was. I mean, my book, which you made reference to, the magnetism of that book was as a human interest story, because it was based on the eccentric choice of a black African pupil in an establishment built by English royalty and not designed with an African background in mind. So based on that, an African pupil was something of an eccentric choice for Eton College, built by English royalty, the people who colonized Africa. And so inevitably, there did exist supremacist attitudes. And there's no way you could avoid encountering such attitudes, sometimes deployed with hostility, sometimes with patronizing sometimes with love. But at any rate, in as much as they had opened their doors to affect a wind of change by bringing black pupils into school, there's no gainsaying that the white man could never accept the black African as his equal. And it was manifested in some things they said, did, and thought. There's nothing anybody could do about it. It isn't going to change. And they felt they're doing me a favor. People used to say, do you know how lucky you are going to Eton College? Well, so really it wasn't something which I think it was an eccentric choice. To me, I could call it an adventure. Others would say it was a misadventure. But as the case may be, it was a situation that it was a matter of how do you cope with all the different things you encountered, which all had undertones of racism.
Mm. Yes, and 3 years after you obtained your school leaving certificate from Eton College, so this was in 1969, you actually received an official letter informing you that you were banned from visiting the school. What was your initial reaction to this?
This happened, the ban, it was imposed in 1971. My book was serialized in England in a magazine, a two-part serialization. And once the serialization ran its course, I got a letter from the headmaster saying you were banned because what you wrote was a damning indictment against the school. And it's a lie. It's not true. It never happened.
Right.
And it bore no relation whatsoever to the facts. So you are banned until further notice. So please don't come back. My reaction was amusement because it made headlines. The thing, it became world news. And Nigerian newspapers picked up the serialization, republished it. And I wrote a letter back to the headmaster saying, I doubt whether you as a white headmaster will be aware of the facts on which my views are based. I just replied to him. Then I wrote a letter, a complaint to the British Race Relations Board. And I said, look, I can count at least 4 examples, cases where people have written damning write-ups against Eton College. They weren't banned. So why should my own case be different?
Right.
That caused more sensation worldwide. The head of Eton reported to the race board. And then at the end of the day, the thing fizzled out. Then about a year later, the book came out, 1972. And the wealth of press, global press coverage. And they now wrote letters saying the ban is still on. They haven't changed from the ban. So I said, fine. So that was that. So I took it for granted. Okay, I'm banned. Good luck. You don't want me, I don't want you either. So the feeling is perfectly mutual. So that was the situation. But as regards my father, he was aware. I used to write letters complaining, look, I'm being called nigger. My father said, oh, don't listen to these people. But when he was in England, he was called also some names, nigger, blah, 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 blah. I should pay no heed. So he didn't really take it seriously. I think it was anticipated that one would encounter that at some stage.
Just pausing there, this anecdote of your father, because he went to Oxford and was worked at the International Criminal Court. And you're saying that he's also experienced some of these things. So for him, it was almost normalized, and this was something he felt that you needed to come to terms with or just to deal with.
My father wrote and said, oh, don't worry about it. Pay no heed. Those were his words, pay no heed. When he was in England as a student, he used to call all sorts of names, but I shouldn't take it seriously. That was his reaction. I didn't see it in that way. I felt, look, why should these people, that was what happened here. But there was a very definite existence of supremacist attitudes, which one was compelled to rebel against. And I did so violently.
Well, yes, it's understandable. And actually many of those supremacist attitudes still exist today in the world generally, not just at Eton. But recently, with the recent discussions of race, particularly in the US, the headmaster of Eton issued you an apology, which you graciously accepted. So talk me through how you felt. Was that some kind of closure for you? And will you be paying the school a visit at some point?
Well, it all somehow fitted into the Black Lives Matter struggle, which was a global event. And somehow it came up, because the book is still in print, although it's a revised edition. of the first one. Still in print and is still making waves, sold out many times. And so BBC, I think, got involved and took up that issue. Why are you still banned? I said, well, I have no idea. Although some years ago, I got one letter from an ex-provost saying, oh, you're free to come back. But I think it was more like tongue-in-cheek. It's like lip service. I didn't really take it seriously. But then this became a public apology, which I was a bit taken aback because I wasn't expecting it. So I said to the headmaster, well, thank you very much. And he says he'd like to personally say sorry in person. And we have since that time been negotiating whether I should go to England, go to Eton College. And he tendered an official apology. So we're working towards that. But with this pandemic, this upsurge in pandemic, everything has been put on hold until the situation is better, until things get better health-wise. And I certainly want to go to England now. So I think, right now the plans are in progress. They'll pay my trip, everything else, to go there and address the school. And he'll make an official apology to me personally in front of the world press. So that is now has been arranged and agreed in principle, yes.
Oh, that's excellent. Very good.
So I'm anticipating in the next 5-6 months, I should come to London and go to Eton College. So that is what is up right now.
So where did your passion for writing start?
It started at school. I heard